going into this clean tilt that we have going on here.
If you smell what the rock is cooking.
The myth, is it a fact? Barrel's gonna drag.
The rock says, the rock.
Yanking off a ton of balls, didn't have a ton of space. Is this thing on?
The rock says.
All right, guys, you know what it is. Joey Cunha, AKA the People's Champ. Hold my belt, man. All right, we're gonna get into it today. What we're actually gonna break down is we're gonna kind of go into the tilting action of how Teacherman talks about how we're loading the hip and how we're coming out of the hip and going into this clean tilt that we have going on here. Okay, so what do we have right? So Teacherman, when he kind of goes into what he's seeing within the movements of rotation, is he's seeing hip extension. And hip extension does happen throughout the swing, and you do want hip extension as you're getting in when you're rotating. So the difference is because, you know, one thing we really want to talk about with the hip extension is that we do want that rotation and we do want that move happening as we're kind of getting into contact. But the problem is there's a bunch of different ways to create hip extension. Okay, there's multiple ways to do so. So let's go basic, like we're thinking like a deadlift, right? So if I was going into my deadlift, what a lot of guys end up doing wrong is, one, I can like squat, there's a whole bunch of other things, but the main thing why a lot of people hurt their back, right, is as they deadlift, they try to pull with their back to extend their hips. Right? Instead of driving their feet into the ground and driving their hips forward to extend, where they're getting in this position here, and you're not getting a bunch of hyper extension of the back and a bunch of extension this way, where again it's putting a lot of pressure on the back, especially to a lot of our extensors and also on our low back quite a bit. Now, the same thing kind of happens when we actually go into a tilt move. When you're actually getting into that tilt, one way to find hip extension is to tilt my body, or again, as my hip shoots forward here, I'm gonna get in this position here. Now, as you see, this creates this like backwards C in my back body, and you also see, that's why a lot of times with this hitters, you'll see them go like this as they're hitting the ball, because they are tilting their hips. They're tilting and going into extension here as they're turning, which is creating this up, which is also creating some barrel depth, especially when adapted with the tilt move. I'm gonna get my barrel depth, and also with that being said, I'm not gonna shift forward. So what he does have right with that move as well is that, yes, one of the biggest issues when guys start striding, and this is why also too, he likes a lot of guys with no strides, and one of the reasons that a lot of people teach the no stride, and we use from launch quite a bit, one of the big reasons with that is that, yes, when I talk about pelvic stability and actually moving through and actually being able to hit the ball, is that I'm balancing and trying to guide my entire body while this pitch is coming, right? I want to be adjustable. I want to get my foot down when I want to get my foot down. I don't want to get stuck on my back leg and getting blown up by fastballs, right? I don't want to be early to my front side. All of these other things that end up happening. So what happens with a lot of guys that they actually start doing is, for him, he doesn't want guys to get to the front side too early. But the problem is when we do that tilt move, we actually don't get forward at all. We end up getting stuck on our backside, and I actually get stuck here, and then this is when I start getting blown up by a lot of fastballs, and this puts me on pace actually still to cut across the zone, because I actually get early hip extension, and when I get early hip extension, my pelvis is gonna stop early. It is also, hip extension is a decel move. The extension actually stops my hips and transfers the force up my body. So when I actually get that early hip extension, my pelvis is actually gonna stop, and also my train tracks, we talk about the lower half, the pelvis being more like the train tracks. I actually stole this from Lance Wheeler. The lower half being more like train tracks and the upper half being a train, is that when I set that direction, and again, if I look at you guys and I set that direction, right, and we use this white line here, as I tilt, my hip actually enters the lane where I want my elbow to be clearing. So now that also sets me out where it pushes everything out when I do that move. And then again, I end up cutting across the zone. That's why also a lot of times with those hitters, they struggle with covering balls more down and away, especially when they're breaking balls, because my direction is being pulled off and it's pulling me out of posture, right? This move is pulling me out of posture. That move is pulling me out of posture, right? Do you see him coming out of posture? Because the tilting motion pulls me out of posture because I'm using my back and also using this tilting move with my pelvis by pushing to get this tilt to happen, which sets this angle. That's why also, as we get in, while there is a lot of guys that he likes hitting, like again, we walked into Mike Trout or etc., these other guys that he's talking about, or even a lot of lefties like Shohei Ohtani and some of these other guys we talked about, is they'll kick back, right? And again, you'll see that scissor move as they go to hit. Well, the problem is when I load my pelvis like this and I shoot my pelvis in like this, I will never kick back. I won't kick back if I move my pelvis that way. And the reason that is how I'm putting force and utilizing the ground to create force. So I actually am using in some force, he'll talk about it within torsion, right? But we talk about torque and creating torque into the floor, which is this outward, it could be outward or inward, right? But with this, as we get into the ground, as I'm doing this twisting motion into the ground to create that torque into the ground, what this happens is what creates me from stopping and again getting good direction when I'm creating rotational force this way is if I just create a whole bunch of tension and rotational force and we think about balance, people utilize the word balance and don't remember balance is equal and opposite, right? So if I'm creating all of this force to rotate, I need to be able to create equally some force, and not only just equally, I have to be able to stop it within a millisecond of going into the ball. Now, a lot of people think that this is like an active stop, like I'm actively trying to stop at contact and actively trying to stop my body. There's a big difference there between mechanical tension and active tension. And again, that's more mechanical tension, just a quick rundown, is like a rope when it runs out of slack. There is no active part of that. When I run out of slack, like, you know, if you think of like a dog being tied up by his collar and he runs away, when you run out of slack, you immediately stop, right? Because I ran out of slack. And then there's the opposite side where active tension is like the dog running and then he just slams into the ground and he forces himself to stop. Those are two different tensions in our body when we take in like the fascial system and we take in again like muscles and pulling out slack and trying to stop that way. So there's different things, and again within our courses online we go into that and dive into that a lot deeper, but I want to kind of come past that point. So what happens here is that when I'm on my back leg and I do this tilt move, right, to create this motion here, or this falling off the cliff as they talk about, and I get this motion here, yeah, I don't shift early. That's great. The problem is again, I also sacrifice my space and my direction through the ball. I do have barrel depth, I'll give it. We got the barrel depth, we got the no shift. The problem is I never get to my front side, so when I go into the decel side, that's why you'll also see when he does a lot of his moves and he goes like this, you'll see him like falling over home plate, or you'll see him over rotating and spinning off the ball. And the reason that is I have a really hard time stopping my acceleration and to deceleration and transferring that energy up my body and into the ball because of how I'm trying to create force. So this is what happens when I become more advantageous of understanding the deceleration side and how acceleration sets me up to decelerate. Yes, the initial part of the swing is very important. How I choose to create force is very important to my ability to decelerate that same force. That's when it comes into like technique. Okay, so as we go in to these moves, the problem is when I get this motion, again, when I go into that tilt, I never get to my front side, I don't actually work reciprocally. Okay, what is reciprocal motion? Reciprocal motion is opposite arm, opposite leg. Just like when I walk, my obliques are working across my body in these slings, and I'm actually using that force from the middle part of my body to create tension, pull out slack, and also propel my body forward and transfer the force that I'm creating from my middle down into the ground, okay? We also have those inside of some of our courses as well. You actually watch people that don't have legs and how they walk when they have lost their legs due to a tragic accident or something like that as well. They can actually still walk by still disassociating, which again, that's going the opposite way as my upper body, right? Disassociating my upper body, my trunk from my pelvis. I'm creating that reciprocal motion to create force. The problem is when we get one-legged and we don't understand the importance of lead leg force, right? And this is a very different, and this is where he's also right, this is very different than lead leg blocking. Very different. A lot of people, when they think about lead leg blocking, what they're doing is they're jumping out of their backside, landing on their front side, completely negating what the backside has done. And again, like he's also talking about, completely negating how I'm starting my rotation and the technique early in the swing. I do not want to jump out of my backside and land on my front, try to stop, and then hit the ball. That is not what I'm trying to do. Now, what we're seeing here, and where he's right, is that again, a lot of times with a lot of athletes, they can't control their weight, right? And that's because there's a majority of athletes have pelvic strength and stability issues. Majority of athletes, okay? So with that, it takes a lot of focus, and again, and it also takes a lot of training to train up that stability within the pelvis, and you have to use proper technique so that I'm not putting my pelvis in a position where it's going to be weak, right? Every muscle, when put in a bad position, is going to be weak. You can train it all you want to get it as strong as possible, but if I put the body in a position where it's not in a good position of leverage, I'm also not going to be strong as well, right? So I need to leverage my strength and my body. Okay, so let's go back into the lead leg right here, right? The reciprocal motion, as you'll see, is that when we look into a lot of hitters, right, and I actually posted a video about this a while ago, that when we looked into Hall of Fame hitters, majority of them start closed, right? Stride closed or swivel closed with their pelvis, okay? Or stride and then kick back to a closed position. Okay, now why is that, right? That comes into a lot of things when you actually start studying again, how they're creating force in the ground, reciprocal force, and what happens is it actually puts them in a position of changing their orientation actually into their strike, which I'll get into in a different video. But when you look at the best in the world and you look at the ground force that they're creating with their front side, it's very, very important into how I'm transferring force up my body. This is why people get confused and they start trying to slam their foot into the ground and they start trying to be really heavy on their front side because they're trying to generate all this force. And that is, no, even though that is another way of creating force, that is not correct technique. I'm trying to cheat a metric rather than moving and creating a movement that will create good data. Two different things, okay? So, big things I want to go back to with how the pelvis moves compared to how he teaches it. This is also why a lot of his hitters, he'll have them turn in their back foot so that they can load this hip here. That's also why he loves so much of the hook'em drill. Not a big fan of the hook'em drill because of, again, a lot of guys will come out of this move, get at in range. The body doesn't want to be in this in range as well. They've curled everything in, and then as they swing, they drag their barrel into the zone, and actually, again, completely, if you measure them on K-Vest or 4D or inside of a lab, and you look at the kinematics, their deceleration parts of their graph will be more like humps instead of real steep declines, right? So the best in the world, you'll see these really hard decels. And the reason that is because of their technique and how they're actually decelerating. Again, remember with the dog running, when I run out of rope, think of all the force that's put into that animal. All of that force that he used to accelerate is also being used to decelerate. It's not an active just stop. It's great when I have a great athlete and he can just slam into the ground or he can just slam into his body and stop. Those are different things, okay? We want to have active tension, but if we sequence well and we do everything with proper technique, we can take advantage of mechanical tension across our body, pulling out that slack so that we can transfer this energy up the body and actually into the ball, okay? So, when it comes to the pelvis, okay, with your foot position, people get caught up where your foot has to be in, it has to be straight, it has to be out. Depending on how the body is put together and anatomically how they're put together, there's a big difference of where I need to put their feet. And again, I can do all of them, okay? More often than not, because of the movement, a lot of people too, you have a lot less, just from a genetic standpoint, a lot less internal rotation that I do externally, just with the anatomy of my body, just purely genetically. But with that being said as well, that's not true for everybody. Some people have more internal rotation than they do external. Again, it's independent by how somebody injuries and things that they've been through their life, but that's not the big issue, okay? So as we figure out and individualize foot positioning, what we're gonna do is, again, with our body is understanding, again, like a swivel going forward, and you'll see athletes as they go forward, they internally rotate into their back hip. Now, if I just turn everything in like this, right, whatever I put into my swing, I'm gonna get out of my swing. So if I turn everything in, turn my whole back to the pitcher, and then come back this way, I'm gonna spin, drag my barrel, and again, I'm gonna have spacing and direction issues. I have to be able to create tension, almost like a bow and arrow, that as I'm getting forward, I'm setting my direction with my front side, and again, creating that bow and arrow so that I'm stretching these, again, as we talked about in the last video, these obliques and this anterior oblique sling, so that I can utilize this force and this bow and arrow to launch and, yes, snap my body. That snap feel that he's feeling and that burst that people are feeling is when I get my body into these positions where I'm creating stretch. That stretch creates an instant go. And yes, I don't want to be pushing. Nobody wants everybody to push. Nobody wants somebody to drag. But there's a lot of things that go into those things of why somebody is pushing, why somebody is dragging, and it's not one thing that fixes the end all be all, right? There's a lot of things that go into of why somebody might be doing so. So we do have a fascial line and what he's feeling. We do have a fascial line that runs through our body down and around our leg this way as well. Another fascial line that when we twist this way, again, it's going to create tension into the floor. It is going to create force. And then when I come back out of it and again go to this snap move, I am going to feel this instant, like the snap feel, this burst, whatever you want to call it. The problem is, to create that force, I sacrificed my space and direction. Okay? There's a lot of ways to create force. I can move well, I can not move well. I can do moves that create quickness and barrel depth, but lose space and direction. I can do moves that create space and direction, but also lose me force. That also loses me force, or I sacrifice force for. So we got to understand, as we start getting deeper, is that there's a lot of ways to create force. There's a lot of truths in different camps and what they believe, but in reality, there's more truth in the middle, right? And everybody has certain pieces, and it's not that someone's wrong, they do feel what they feel. There is these things that are happening, but what am I losing to create one thing or another? And for one hitter, it might feel really good. For one hitter, it might feel really good because, again, I was lunging so bad and I was jumping out of my back leg that, yeah, thinking about getting into my back hip and over-exaggerating some of these feels and doing some of these things and turning my back foot in and really practicing on commanding internal rotation with my back hip might be really good for one guy. For another guy, it might be the worst thing for them. If I'm already a guy that's getting stuck on my backside and I'm already pushing and tilting my hips and extending my back and already doing this, you teaching me to do that is going to be even worse. If I'm already stuck on my backside, those are guys that might have to really emphasize on getting forward, really getting into their front leg. Perfect example of this, Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds was a guy that a lot of times he'd get stuck on his back leg. So what did Bonds always talk about? Bonds always talked about his front foot getting into the ground, right? And then getting to a good launch position that he can get his front foot into the ground, and also always talked about his top hand. Why did he always talk about his top hand? Because he had a problem where he'd get stuck on his backside and he would lose his barrel. So what would he talk about, right? And he would spin off balls. So he really focused on his top hand and getting into his front side, the opposite extreme of what he already did, okay? So wrapping all those things together, right? The tilt move is one way of hip extension. How we really want, again, extension is as we rotate. As we rotate, my front foot will actually, if we look at a force plate, will be putting force into the ground towards home plate, and my back foot will be putting force into the ground this way. Why is it doing that? My pelvis, as I'm rotating, is putting that force into the ground. I'm creating pressure into those parts of my feet. I'm creating a reciprocal move. That's why when you see hockey players, why they do they do a kickback, every single one of them when they do slap shots. And then also, again, when you see golfers, I have videos of golfers, when they're on ice, you'll see the same thing. The feet will go like this. The front foot will slide forward. The back one will slide this way. Okay, so as I'm rotating, and I get in my rotation and I stay in posture and I'm firing here, I'm going to get to that hip extension, and I have a little bit more range of motion than other guys where I can rotate this far and my foot still stay anchored to the ground. I've also practiced it and I'm a lot looser than a lot of guys. Some guys, as they're turning, the foot will start turning a little bit more, but the pelvis is peeling the foot off the ground. And again, even if it's like this, right? The pelvis is peeling the foot off the ground, and a lot of times you'll see the leg turn and the foot up, but the foot's still sideways. That's because the rotation is not starting from the floor. That's why you also see Teacherman's guys where they'll finish like this, and their ankle is almost touching the floor. The reason that is because that's how they're loading their hip. So when they go to fire, it comes like this and they almost fall. And again, they're falling over home plate and their ankle is almost touching the ground. And why they can't kick back is because of how they're using the floor to create force, okay? So a lot more information in there. There's a lot going on within the whole swing. Obviously can't break it all down within a video or within a thread, but wanted to give you guys some useful tips and some things to pull from. If you want to dive deeper, get more information, for sure, obviously dive into Farm Plus. There's a lot of courses and more information on there where you can figure out the drills we're using to get guys to move properly, to get them to not lunge into their front side, or to get them to not be stuck on their backside and getting blown up by fastballs. All of those things all come together for another swing. Can I please get my belt? Can I please get my belt? I need my belt. All right, just in case you guys forgot. Just in case you guys forgot, People Champ, baby. People's Champ. Here for y'all. Until next time.
If you smell what the rock is cooking.